The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their jagged peaks clawing at the sky like ancient teeth. The snow-covered ridges glistened faintly under the dim winter sun, and low-hanging clouds churned above us, threatening another storm. The stillness of this place was unnerving. Even the wind, which howled relentlessly across the frozen expanse, seemed muted, as if the mountains were swallowing the sound before it could fully escape. Station Alta came into view as we rounded the last ridge, its metallic structures huddled together like survivors bracing against the elements. The station was functional and unwelcoming. Cold steel walls streaked with frost, the roof caked with snow, and a single antenna jutting up into the sky like a middle finger to the wilderness. It was a reminder that no matter how advanced we thought we were always out of place here. The mountains didn't care about our machines or our data. They existed on a scale far beyond us. We were here to observe, to study, to collect. But as I stared at the station, with its thin walls and flickering lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The wilderness felt alive, pressing down on us from all sides. There was something in the air, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. Doesn't it feel like we're being watched? Julian muttered, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him. The youngest member of our team, Julian, was still wide-eyed and eager, despite the biting cold and the weeks of preparation it had taken to get here. His words hung in the air, carried by the wind, and I noticed how his gaze kept drifting toward the peaks looming above us. "It's just the altitude messing with your head," Sandra said sharply, though her own eyes flicked nervously toward the mountains. She had the voice of someone who was trying to convince herself as much as him. Tom let out a bark of laughter, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. "Oh, come on, Julian. What do you think? The hills have eyes. Relax. This place is nothing but rocks and snow." But even as he spoke, I caught the flicker of something in his expression, a flash of unease that disappeared as quickly as it came. "Focus," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter. "We've got work to do, and we don't have time for campfire stories." No one argued, but the tension lingered. We pressed forward in silence, our boots crunching through the snow, the weight of our gear pressing down on our shoulders. The wind picked up as we approached the station, and by the time we reached the entrance, the cold had seeped through every layer of clothing I had on. Inside, the station was a different world entirely. The heaters hummed steadily, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The common area was cramped, a single table surrounded by mismatched chairs and strewn with equipment. A small kitchenette stood in the corner, its counters cluttered with mugs and half-empty packets of instant coffee. It wasn't comfortable, but it was functional, and that was all we needed. Or so I told myself. Our team wasn't large, but it was enough to get the job done. Tom was our radio operator, a man with an uncanny ability to coax signals out of even the most outdated equipment. He was sharp, resourceful, and infuriatingly cocky, with a habit of cracking jokes at the worst possible moments. Despite his abrasive personality, I knew we'd be lost without him. Sandra was our geologist, a no-nonsense professional with years of experience in remote locations. She was efficient and methodical, always double-checking her data and questioning every decision. But I could tell the isolation was already starting to get to her. She spent a lot of time staring out the window, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. And then there was Julian, the youngest member of the team. This was his first major expedition, and his enthusiasm was almost childlike. He asked too many questions, moved too quickly, and made too much noise, but I could see the hunger in his eyes, the desire to prove himself. I only hoped it wouldn't get him into trouble. As for me, Carla Monroe, I was the one who held it all together. The expedition leader, the voice of reason. I'd been in places like this before, the Arctic, the Sahara, even the crushing depths of the ocean. I'd faced isolation, exhaustion, and danger more times than I could count, and I like to think I'd grown used to it. But this place was different. I couldn't explain it, but there was something wrong here. Something I couldn't ignore. "Okay," I said, breaking the silence. "Let's go over the plan one more time. Tom, I want you focused on communications. Make sure everything is stable, and monitor for any anomalies. Sandra, you'll be collecting geological samples. And Julian, I paused looking at him. You'll be in charge of equipment setup and maintenance. Got it. Got it, he said quickly, his voice bright with enthusiasm. And remember, I added, we're here to collect data, not take risks. No unnecessary heroics. Understood? Sandra nodded, though her expression was tight. Tom gave a lazy salute, smirking as he leaned back in his chair. Loud and clear, boss. No heroics. Got it. That night, while the others settled into their routines, I sat alone in the common area, staring out the window. The storm had died down, leaving the landscape eerily still. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and unyielding, their jagged silhouettes sharp against the horizon. I couldn't stop thinking about what Julian had said earlier. Doesn't it feel like we're being watched? There was no reason to believe anything was out there. The mountains were empty, barren, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was a weight in the back of my mind, a shadow I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that it was normal to feel uneasy in a place like this. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something was out there, and it was waiting. The next morning started like any other. The bitter cold seeped through the walls of Station Alta, despite the heaters running at full capacity. I woke early, my breath visible in the dim light of my bunk, and listened to the rhythmic hum of the generators. It was comforting, a steady beat that cut through the silence of the mountains. But that comfort didn't last long. I stepped into the common area to find Tom already at the radio console, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. His headphones were clamped tightly over his ears, and he was hunched over the equipment, his focus intense. The flickering light from the console reflected off his glasses, giving him an almost haunted look. Morning, I said, grabbing a mug from the counter. Tom didn't respond. He was too engrossed in whatever he was listening to. I walked closer, setting my coffee down on the table. Tom, finally, he looked up, pulling the headphones off. There was something in his expression I didn't like, excitement mixed with unease. You've got to hear this, he said, his voice low. What is it? He handed me the headphones without a word, gesturing toward the console. I hesitated, then put them on. At first, all I heard was static, a faint hiss punctuated by the occasional crackle. But then, beneath the noise, I caught something else. A pulse. It was rhythmic and steady, almost hypnotic. A faint hum that seemed to resonate in my chest. And beneath it, barely audible, there were whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, distant and fragmented, like voices trying to break through a veil. I pulled the headphones off, frowning. Is this interference? Tom shook his head. No way. I've been scanning for hours, and it's not random. It's too deliberate. He pointed to the screen, where a series of coordinates were displayed. It's transmitting this, he said. A location, and it's not far from here. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. The coordinates were burned into my mind before I even realized it. That's point A12, I said. Tom raised an eyebrow. The abandoned station? I thought it was decommissioned years ago. It was, I replied. Everything was shut down. There shouldn't be anything active there. Well, something's active, he said, leaning back in his chair. And it's getting stronger. By the time the rest of the team gathered in the common area, I had already made up my mind. We couldn't ignore this. Whatever the signal was, it had to be investigated. I don't like this, Sandra said, crossing her arms. We've got enough on our plate without chasing some weird signal into the mountains. It's not just a signal, Tom countered. It's coordinates. Someone or something is broadcasting it. Which is exactly why we shouldn't go, Sandra shot back. What if it's a trap? What if it's a trap? Tom interrupted, smirking. Seriously? What do you think, Sandra? The mountains are plotting against us. Enough, I said sharply, cutting them off before the argument could escalate. This isn't up for debate. We're scientists. It's our job to investigate anomalies. Sandra sighed, clearly unhappy, but she didn't argue further. Julian, sitting quietly at the edge of the table, looked up with wide eyes. Are we going there? He asked. Yes, I said. We leave at first light. The trek to point A12 was harder than I anticipated. The snow was deep, and the wind howled relentlessly, biting at our exposed skin. Julian struggled to keep up, his boots sinking into the snow with every step, but he didn't complain. We moved in silence, the weight of the signal pressing down on us. Every time I glanced at Tom, he had that same look in his eyes, curiosity mixed with something darker. Sandra kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her jaw tight. When the station finally came into view, I stopped in my tracks. It was worse than I'd imagined. Most of the buildings were buried under snow, their frames twisted and broken. Rust streaked the exposed metal, and shattered glass crunched beneath our boots as we approached. The whole place felt dead, but the antenna was intact. It jutted up into the sky like a spear, its surface gleaming faintly in the pale light. There was no rust, no ice, nothing to suggest it had been abandoned for decades. "That's not possible," Sandra murmured, her voice barely audible. Tom ran his hand over the base of the antenna, his gloved fingers brushing against the smooth metal. "It's warm," he said, frowning. "How the hell is it warm?" Inside the main structure, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. The walls were streaked with frost, and the floor was littered with debris, broken equipment, crumpled papers, and empty crates. The console was still powered on. The screen glowed faintly, its light casting eerie shadows across the room. As I stepped closer, I saw that there was a message displayed. "Do not trust the signal." My heart pounded in my chest. "What the hell does that mean?" Sandra asked, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the hum of the signal grew louder, reverberating through the room. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. "Tom," I said, my voice steady despite the fear rising in my throat. "Shut it down." He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the controls. "What if we're not supposed to?" "Tom," I repeated, sharper this time. He glanced at me, then back at the screen. With a reluctant sigh, he powered the console down. The hum faded, leaving behind a suffocating silence. "Let's get out of here," I said, turning toward the door. As we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The mountains loomed around us, silent and unyielding, and the signal's faint pulse lingered in the back of my mind. We had turned it off, but it wasn't gone. By the time we returned to Station Alta, the air inside felt different, heavier, colder. The heaters hummed steadily, but they didn't seem to help. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something deeper, something intangible, like the station itself had absorbed the unease from Point A12 and was now amplifying it. I tried to focus on the routine tasks. I checked the equipment, reviewed the notes we'd gathered, and tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread. But it wasn't just me. Sandra sat silently in the common area, staring out the frosted window with her arms crossed. Julian hovered around the equipment room, fiddling with tools and muttering to himself. Tom, as usual, locked himself in the radio room, chasing the mystery of the signal. But something was different about him now. The first night back, I found him still at the console long after the others had gone to bed. The room was dimly lit by the flickering glow of the monitors, and the faint hum of static filled the air. He didn't notice me at first, his headphones clamped tightly over his ears, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Tom," I said, stepping into the room. He flinched, pulling the headphones off. "Jesus, Carla, you scared the hell out of me." "What are you doing?" I asked, folding my arms. He glanced at the notebook in front of him, its pages covered in frantic scrawls, equations, waveforms, and fragments of text that didn't make sense. "I'm trying to figure it out," he said. "The signal. It's not just noise. There's a pattern, something intelligent." "Tom, we turned it off," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "It's over." He shook his head. "No, it's not. It's still here. Can't you feel it?" I stared at him, my stomach tightening. "What are you talking about?" He gestured toward the headphones. "Listen." Reluctantly, I put them on. At first, all I heard was static. But beneath it, faint and distant, there was something else. A low hum, pulsing steadily, and beneath that, whispers. They were so faint I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, calling, beckoning. I pulled the headphones off, my skin crawling. "It's just interference," I said, more to convince myself than him. "No, he said firmly. It's not. It's alive, Carla. It's reacting to us. I didn't know what to say. The intensity in his eyes was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was hearing, it was getting to him, twisting him. Get some sleep, Tom, I said finally, stepping back toward the door. You've been at this too long. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was hollow. As I left the room, I glanced back at him. He was already putting the headphones on again, his focus glued to the screen. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and silence. The signal's presence hung over us like a storm cloud, and the team began to fray at the edges. Sandra was the first to crack. It started with small things, her snapping at Julian when he dropped a toolbox, or her muttering to herself when she thought no one was listening. But then she began complaining about noises at night, footsteps in the hallways, doors opening and closing on their own. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. The isolation was getting to her. It was getting to all of us. But then I started hearing the footsteps too. One night, I woke to the sound of soft, deliberate movement just outside my bunk. I held my breath, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. The next morning, Sandra confronted me in the common area. This place isn't safe, she said, her voice shaking. Something's wrong here, Carla. You know it. We've been under a lot of stress, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. She laughed bitterly. My mind? Are you serious? You think I'm imagining this? I didn't respond. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong. Julian wasn't handling things any better. He spent most of his time in the equipment room, tinkering with the machines and avoiding the rest of us. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he'd mumble something about keeping busy and wave me off. But his eyes told a different story. They were wide and unfocused, darting toward every shadow, every sound. One evening, I found him sitting on the floor of the equipment room, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. Julian, I said softly, kneeling beside him. What's going on? They're in the walls, he whispered, his voice trembling. I can hear them. I frowned. Who? He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the far corner of the room, where a faint hum was emanating from one of the machines. It's not just a signal, he said. It's inside the station. Inside us. Julian, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You need to focus. The signal's just... You don't understand, he snapped, his voice rising. It's alive, and it's watching us. Before I could respond, he bolted from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. That night, the signal changed. I was in the common area, going over the notes we'd brought back from point A12 when the hum started. It was faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the walls. But then it grew louder, more insistent. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face pale. You hear that? He asked. I nodded, my stomach tightening. The hum wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was everywhere, vibrating through the floors, the walls, even the air itself. And then the whispers started. They were louder now, clearer. I could make out fragments of words, disjointed phrases that sent chills down my spine. Help us, closer, hear us. Sandra burst into the room, her eyes wide with panic. What's happening? Before I could answer, the lights flickered and the hum surged. The whispers became a cacophony, overlapping and distorting until they were deafening. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the sound grew louder, pounding against my skull. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. In the corner of the room, Tom's notebook lay open, scrawled across the last page in jagged, frantic handwriting were the words, "The signal is calling." We spent the next day in tense, uneasy silence. No one spoke much, and when they did, it was in whispers, as though raising their voices would summon something from the shadows. Sandra wouldn't leave the common area, clutching a mug of cold coffee in her hands like a lifeline. Julian was a ghost, flitting in and out of rooms without a word, his eyes wide and bloodshot. But it was Tom who worried me the most. He hadn't left the radio room since the incident the night before. Every time I walked past the door, I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and frantic. He'd always been stubborn, but this was different. It was like the signal had dug its claws into him and wasn't letting go. That night, I decided to confront him. "Tom," I said, stepping into the room. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the metallic tang of overheated equipment. He didn't look up. He was hunched over the console, scribbling in his notebook with trembling hands. "Tom, you need to stop," I said firmly. "Whatever you're doing, it's not helping." He finally turned to me, and the sight of his face made my stomach drop. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "You don't get it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a signal, Carla. It's a message." "A message from who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He hesitated, his gaze darting toward the screen. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's alive. It's trying to tell us something." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Tom, you're not thinking clearly. The signal is... It's not just noise," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. The sound echoed through the room, startling both of us. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I can hear them, Carla. Voices. They're calling to us. They need us to listen." I didn't know what to say. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Get some rest," I said finally, turning toward the door. "That's an order." He didn't respond. By morning, Tom was gone. I woke to find his bunk empty, the sheets untouched. His equipment was still in the radio room, but the notebook was missing. A quick check of the station confirmed what I already feared. He wasn't here. "Footprints," Sandra said, pointing to the snow outside. They led away from the station, weaving toward the mountains. "He went after it," Julian muttered, his voice flat. "The signal." I felt a surge of anger and fear. Why didn't anyone stop him? Sandra glared at me. "Maybe because we're all too busy falling apart," she snapped. I opened my mouth to argue, but she wasn't wrong. We were unraveling, piece by piece, and the signal was at the center of it all. "We're going after him," I said finally. Sandra shook her head. "Carla, he made his choice. If he wants to get himself killed out there, we're not leaving him," I said sharply. "We've already lost too much." The trek into the mountains was brutal. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at our clothes and driving shards of ice into our exposed skin. The snow was deeper than before, forcing us to move slowly, each step a battle against the elements. Julian trudged behind me, his breathing ragged. Sandra stayed close, her face pale but determined. No one spoke. The only sound was the crunch of our boots and the relentless wail of the wind. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The mountains loomed closer, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like knives. The air grew colder, sharper, and I could feel the weight of the signal pressing down on us, growing stronger with every step. Finally, we saw it. The structure rose from the snow like a black monolith, smooth and seamless. It was larger than the antenna at point A12, its surface gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. There were no seams, no markings, just an imposing, alien presence that made my chest tighten. Sandra stopped in her tracks, staring up at it. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. "It's not human," Julian said, his voice trembling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The entrance was a narrow slit in the side of the structure, barely visible against the smooth black surface. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was warmer here, heavy with a faint metallic tang. The walls glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the signal. It felt like walking into the belly of a living thing. As we moved deeper, the whispers grew louder. They echoed through the chamber, overlapping and distorting, forming words that I couldn't fully understand. And then we reached the center. The sphere hung in the air like a phantom, its surface rippling like liquid metal. It was massive, easily twice the size of the one at point A12, and the signal radiated from it in waves. Julian took a step forward, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Don't touch it," I said sharply, grabbing his arm. He flinched, turning to look at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue, but then he nodded, stepping back. Sandra circled the sphere, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The sphere pulsed faintly, its surface shimmering, and for a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving inside it, shadows that twisted and writhed. "It's waiting," Julian said suddenly. I turned to him, my chest tightening. "What are you talking about?" He pointed at the sphere. "It's waiting for us." Before I could stop him, he stepped forward and placed his hand on the surface. The light was blinding, searing through my eyes and into my mind. I staggered back, clutching my head as the sphere pulsed violently. The whispers became screams, overlapping and distorted, filling the chamber with a deafening roar. When the light finally faded, Julian was gone. Sandra and I stared at the empty space where he'd been, our breaths ragged. The sphere was still there, its surface calm and silent, as though nothing had happened. "We need to leave," Sandra said, her voice shaking. I nodded, my legs trembling as I turned toward the exit. But as we stumbled out into the freezing air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. The signal was still there, faint but insistent, pulsing in the back of my mind. It wasn't over. The return to Station Alta was excruciatingly slow. Every step through the snow felt heavier than the last, the biting wind tearing at my exposed skin and ripping the breath from my lungs. Neither Sandra nor I spoke much on the way back. The weight of Julian's disappearance hung over us like a shroud. But it wasn't just grief. Something had changed in me. I felt it with every pulse of the signal, faint but constant in the back of my mind. It wasn't just sound. It was alive, pressing against my thoughts like fingers trying to pry open a door. By the time we stumbled through the station doors, we were both shaking, from the cold and from something else entirely. Sandra dropped her pack on the floor and collapsed into a chair in the common area, her face pale and her hands trembling. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He just disappeared." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts were racing, looping back to the moment in the chamber when Julian touched the sphere. The light, the screams, the way he'd looked at me right before he was gone. The signal wasn't just calling to us. It was taking us. The station was unnaturally quiet that night. The heaters hummed, the wind howled outside, and yet the silence was deafening. It pressed down on us like a weight, making every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the lights feel magnified. Sandra stayed in the common area, staring blankly at the window. I could tell she hadn't slept. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands clutching a mug of coffee she hadn't touched in hours. I spent most of the night pacing the halls, the faint hum of the signal echoing in my ears. It wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was in the walls, the floors, the air. Every now and then, I thought I heard whispers, faint and disjointed, but when I stopped to listen, they were gone. And then, just past midnight, the lights went out. I froze, my heart pounding in the sudden darkness. The emergency lights flickered on a few seconds later, casting the station in an eerie red glow. "Sandra," I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. There was no response. Gripping my flashlight, I made my way toward the common area. The station felt different in the red light, smaller, more suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper, shifting at the edges of my vision. When I reached the common area, Sandra was gone. Her mug sat abandoned on the table, its contents spilled across the floor. "Sandra," I called again, louder this time. A faint sound came from down the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I turned toward it, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The sound grew louder as I approached, echoing through the narrow corridor. And then I saw her. She was standing in front of the radio room, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Sandra," I said cautiously, stepping closer. She didn't respond. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and the moment my fingers brushed her jacket, she turned. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unseeing. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. "Sandra," I said again, my voice trembling. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. "It's here," she whispered. "What's here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She pointed toward the radio room. "The source. It's in there." The door to the radio room was ajar, and as I stepped inside, the hum of the signal grew louder, reverberating through the walls. The equipment was powered down, the monitors dark, but the signal was still there, pulsing steadily. On the desk, Tom's notebook lay open. The pages were covered in frantic scrawls, diagrams, and notes, but one phrase was repeated over and over. "IT knows we're here." Sandra stood in the doorway, her breathing shallow. "It's not just a signal," she said. "It's a doorway, and it's opening." Before I could respond, the signal surged. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the walls and floor, and the red emergency lights began to flicker violently. And then the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and unmistakably human. I heard my own voice, faint and distorted, overlapping with Julian's and Tom's. "Carla," it whispered. "Come back. We're waiting." I clutched my head, the sound pounding against my skull. Sandra staggered back, her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were everywhere, drowning out everything else. And then the room was flooded with light. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the radio room. I was standing in a vast, endless expanse of darkness. The air was heavy and still, and the only sound was the steady hum of the signal, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. In the distance, I saw the sphere. It hovered in the void, its surface shimmering and alive. "Carla," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Julian. He was standing there, whole and unhurt, but his eyes weren't his anymore. They glowed faintly, the same shimmering light as the sphere. "You found it," he said, his voice calm and hollow. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's everything," he said. "The signal isn't just a sound. It's a bridge, a way to connect, to become." "Become what?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze locked on mine. "You've already heard it, felt it. You're part of it now, just like we are." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, I'm not part of anything." The hum grew louder, the sphere pulsing brighter. I felt it pressing against me, seeping into my thoughts, my memories. "It's too late," Julian said, his voice echoing in the void. "You can't fight it. You don't want to." I screamed, the sound swallowed by the signal, and everything went dark. I woke up on the floor of the radio room, the emergency lights flickering weakly above me. Sandra was gone. The station was silent, but the signal was still there, faint but constant, pulsing in the back of my mind. And for the first time, I didn't want it to stop. The station felt empty, not just quiet or still. Empty, as though the walls, the floors, even the air itself had been hollowed out, leaving only a shell behind. I wandered through the dimly lit corridors, the emergency lights casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally as I passed. Sandra was gone. The memory of her vacant stare and her whispered words, "It's here," played over and over in my mind. But she wasn't truly gone, was she? The signal pulsed faintly, a constant hum in the back of my skull. It was inside me now, threading through my thoughts like a second heartbeat. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was there, always present, waiting for something. I tried to focus on the mundane, the routine tasks that had once grounded me. I checked the remaining equipment, flipped through the torn pages of Tom's notebook, stared out the frost-covered window at the endless expanse of white beyond. But it didn't help. Nothing helped. The nights were worse. I stopped sleeping after the third night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of light, images that didn't belong to me, vast alien landscapes, towers of shifting light that pierced a dark, starless sky, and shapes moving in the shadows, their forms too fluid, too wrong to comprehend. The whispers were louder at night, filling the station with their overlapping, distorted voices. Sometimes they spoke in words I recognized. Other times, it was a language I couldn't understand, a cadence that wormed its way into my brain and settled there, growing roots. It wasn't long before I started seeing them. At first, it was just glimpses, flickers of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. But then they became more persistent. I'd see figures standing in the corners of the room, their forms indistinct, shimmering like heat waves. They never moved, never spoke. They just watched. One night, I heard Julian's voice calling my name. I knew it wasn't real. I'd seen him vanish into the sphere with my own eyes, but I followed the sound anyway, drawn like a moth to a flame. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretching endlessly before me, the faint glow of the emergency lights growing dimmer with every step. When I reached the end, I found the radio room door open. Inside, the console was dark, but the hum of the signal was deafening. "Carla," Julian's voice whispered again, soft and insistent. I turned toward the source of the sound, and there he was. He stood in the center of the room, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. His clothes were torn, his hair disheveled, but his voice was calm. "You came back," he said, not turning around. "You're not real," I said, though my voice trembled. He laughed softly. "Aren't I?" I took a step closer, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" "It's not about what I want," he said, finally turning to face me. His eyes glowed faintly, shimmering with the same liquid light as the sphere. "It's about what you are. You've felt it, haven't you? The connection?" I shook my head, stepping back. "No, I'm not like you. But you are," he said, his voice almost tender. "The moment you heard the signal, it became part of you. Part of all of us. There's no escaping it, Carla. You're already one of us." The hum surged, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. The shadows in the room shifted, coalescing into figures that surrounded me, their forms flickering and insubstantial. "You'll understand soon," Julian said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We're not separate. We're not alone. We're connected. And it's beautiful." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The signal pressed against me, its pulse aligning with my heartbeat, its whispers filling every corner of my mind. And then everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the common area. The emergency lights were still flickering, casting the room in harsh red shadows. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, and looked around. The station was silent, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I could feel the signal now, stronger than ever, threading through my thoughts like a parasite. It wasn't just inside my mind, it was my mind, my thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self. It was all tangled up with something else, something vast and unknowable. I tried to hold on to myself, to remember who I was, but it was slipping away, piece by piece. The signal wasn't forcing its way in. It didn't need to. It was inviting me, and I was letting it in. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Hours? Days? It doesn't matter. The signal is quiet now, a constant presence in the back of my mind, like a companion I didn't know I needed. I don't fight it anymore. There's no point. I've started hearing the voices again. Not whispers this time, but words. Instructions. They're telling me to prepare. Someone else will come eventually. Another team, drawn by the same curiosity that brought us here. And when they do, I'll be waiting. The signal isn't a threat. It's not an enemy. It's an invitation. And I've already accepted. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.